So I can go very rapidly on that because you all know we are in an area of crisis on biodiversity, on climate, but also on pollution. You all know that these different crises not only affect biodiversity, but also the ecosystem services from which farmers and society could benefit. We all know that agriculture, and especially conventional agriculture, also has an impact on these different dimensions, and that there is an increasing interest in the design of sustainable agri-food system, and that providing evidence that agroecology could benefit climate mitigation and biodiversity can also be used and show that agroecology could be part of EU policy to achieve their goals. We know that there are benefits of a number of agroecological interventions and that these have been demonstrated. You have here a picture showing flower strips, reduced tillage. We know from this literature that the benefits or absence of benefits really depend on the context. And we know that we can also have mixed effects across organisms and taxa, and that mobile and large taxa are less likely to benefit from agroecological interventions than smaller and less mobile taxa. But overall, there is no synthesis of the effects of biodiversity on climate change mitigation using agroecology as a framework, and this is the knowledge gap we aim to achieve with this literature review. This is something you already seen. There's one, so first we will talk about agroecological interventions, and we will take it at a systemic way. Especially, we will focus on measurements that were done at the farm scale. And sometimes when multiple practices related to agroecology are being developed in a farm, but sometimes there were some practices that are really inspired by ecological processes, and we consider them even if they were at the plot scale. You know also from HLP principle that there is explicit link between agroecology and biodiversity in one of the principle, but there are also different principles related to soil health, recycling, input reduction that all relate to biogeochemical cycles. And so there's also an implicit link to climate change mitigation because acting on these cycles can have an effect on carbon storage in the soil and also on greenhouse gas emissions. This is something you probably know. This is the efficiency substitution redesign model we use also as a part of our research. We consider that we can start talking about agroecology when there is at least substitution at the farm level, and that efficiency is not enough. So we consider conventional and practices that only focus on efficiency as part of a conventional world. Substitution was only investigated when it was made at the farm level, and then there is the redesign, which is when you focus at the agroecosystem level, the higher degree of agroecological transition. And you see that the papers we found, sometimes you can compare conventional and substitution. Sometimes you can compare different level of substitution at the farm level. Sometimes you moved from conventional to redesign, and sometimes from substitution to redesign. So there were different degrees of agroecological transition we could explore in this meta-analysis. And these are a number of practices that we had. So we consider level 2 input substitution. You have this list of practices, and at level 3, you have a number of practices. And it's interesting, I will come back to that at the end of the talk, but some of these redesign practices, diversified crop rotation, intercropping, integration of trees with crops, with livestock, are also the levels, the practices that are mentioned to be at the basis of adaptation to climate change. Our working hypotheses are that agroecological interventions could have a positive effect on biodiversity and climate change metrics. We made the hypothesis that magnitude of positive effects of agroecological intervention on biodiversity may vary depending on the type of organism considered. And we, based on what we found in the literature, we could focus on plants, on pollinators, predator insects, but also soil, micro and macrofauna. We made the hypothesis that the magnitude of agroecological benefits on biodiversity, soil carbon soil, and on the mitigation of greenhouse gas emission may vary with agricultural land use type. And we were successful in finding data papers on 4 land use type, grassland-based system, annual crops, perennial crops, and horticulture. Surprisingly, we didn't find that much on crop livestock interaction, and we consider this crop livestock interaction as a way to diversify annual cropping systems. And as I mentioned, different degree in the transition, we made the hypothesis that positive effects of agroecological interventions are greater where the degree of agroecological transition is larger. So these were our hypotheses. And then we conducted a literature search. We defined keywords. And then doing that, we obtained more than 13,000 candidate papers on biodiversity and the same number of papers on climate change mitigation. So that was a huge work to do then. And we started to look at some of the paper. We say this one are okay. We think we can have material in this one, and this one are not okay. And from this very initial analysis, we fed artificial intelligence that screened all the abstracts and that ranked them in decreasing order of relevance. And that was a way to really go faster within these 13,000 papers. And doing that, and we had also some criteria to stop, because at the end, when you go deeper and deeper, you find less and less relevant paper. The artificial intelligence was, in that case, useful. And at the end, we had 1,261 studies, and this one, we read them. And we extracted for biodiversity 123 studies, from which we extracted data on biodiversity. This data could be related to abundance, richness, diversity indices, and on climate change mitigation metrics, we focus on soil carbon soil and greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, N2O, and methane. The population we started from is the farming system in Europe, and the publication where this publication occurred during 10 years from 2013 to 2024. I've lost control again. Sorry, Tim. Okay, so the final data set, at the end, we analyzed 123 papers on biodiversity, 72 papers on climate change mitigation. As you can see, and this was already mentioned by Raquel, and this is why we put so many efforts to have an analysis of people from Eastern Europe in the Q methodology exercise, you see that it's unfortunately unbalanced, and that we have most studies conducted in Central Europe and Mediterranean areas, and that there is a lack of published data in Eastern Europe. So this is how the results will be presented. You have this line, the dotted line, that represents, that is at 0. If the dot is on the right side, it means that you have a positive effect of agroecological interventions compared to the control that was also analyzed in the same paper. And if you are on the left, it means that there is a negative effect. If the bar, or the horizontal bar, does not touch the dotted line, it means that the effect is statistically significant. And what you can see is that we have a positive overall effect of biodiversity on and in the different taxa on biodiversity, plants, insects, and soil organisms. And you see that it's also less clear for climate change mitigation. There is a positive and a benefit on carbon stocks. There is a benefit on on N2O, but you see that there is an absence of benefit on methane emission and even a negative effect on CO2 emission. And finally, it's quite logical because sometimes agroecology increase biomass, increase root biomass also, and you had finally a very healthy soil. And in a healthy soil, you have more respiration, and that's as a consequence, you have more CO2 emission from these systems. When we analyze these different results, you have on the left biodiversity and on the right climate change mitigation variable. In the four type of systems, you see that for biodiversity, it's working for perennial crops, annual crops, and grassland-based system. What I did not mention is that the figure you have is, for instance, for perennial crops, you have N is 306 and 20. It means that from 20 published papers, we managed to obtain 306 comparison. In horticulture, we were not able to find any significant result, and one reason may be the less number of studies that we could use to compare agroecological system with conventional ones. For climate change mitigation, it's significant for annual crops in arable lands, and you see that there is usually a positive tendency, but also with less papers allowing to investigate that. But overall, a positive effect, but sometimes it's only a trend. We were lucky to have some studies where both dimensions were analyzed, and you see that, so on the x-axis, you have climate change mitigation, on the y-axis, biodiversity. You see related to the overall positive benefits of agroecological intervention of biodiversity that you have nothing below zero, and that frequently you can also obtain some win-win situation. And really, what is behind this are the change driven by by agroecological interventions on micro-decomposer and soil carbon storage, because when you have more carbon in the soil, you are more soil life, more micro-decomposer activity. And that's why in a number of these situations, you had this win-win. And you see, if you look at the dot colors, that it's mainly occurring in annual crops, perennial crops, and horticulture. And what was a surprise is that finally we did not see any contrasting. The effect was positive when you compare substitution with conventional, redesign with substitution, different level of substitution, and redesign with conventional. Also, I forgot one, but you see that the effect globally is positive on biodiversity. But finally, there is not a higher magnitude in the published paper on the effect. If you move from conventional to redesign, it's the same amplitude on average than if you move to conventional to substitution. That was a surprise, and probably more information would be needed to go in deeper into that. Same thing for climate change mitigation. You see that only the substitution to substitution plus level at the farm level did not lead to any significant change, while the three other contrasts led to significant change. So now the other points, we know that we have shown that agroecological interventions can benefit climate mitigation, especially for N2O and for carbon stocks, but do agroecological interventions enhance climate resilience? And this is what we are doing now. We started again with a new batch of papers. This time publication were selected from 2014 to 2025. We were very consistent. We kept exactly the same definition of agroecological definition than in the previous paper. And we consider that we had data on climate resilience dimension when we had time series with at least 3 years of climate change scenario or experimental treatments that would allow to see whether yield and economic variable are stable or less stable according to whether you have agroecological practices or a more conventional system. We started with 4,000 papers. We extracted 1,423 and went to a full text for 247. And at the end, we only selected 33 article for data extractions. More are on yield, more are on annual cropping systems with some on horticulture, and much less information on the other things. And now I will frustrate you because this is work in progress. We were very positive. There's a recently paper that was published by someone called Carolina, and it was an analysis that was published in 2023 in Agroecology and Sustainable Food System that was super positive on the benefits of agroecological interventions on not only climate mitigation, but also adaptation to climate change. This was done in 3 Latin American countries, including Colombia, and they were positive in the tropical world context. More recently, another paper that was coordinated by Moritz van Kosser did a qualitative analysis of 34 meta-analyses on the benefits or absence of benefits of agroecology on adaptation to climate change. And there, the results are completely different. Sometimes you have benefits, sometimes you have no benefits or no effect. So we are now working on this data to extract the data. We will have a data set that is fully consistent with the previous meta-analysis that will focus on Europe only, because in these other meta-analyses, usually data from Europe are mixed with data from other parts of the world. So we will have an answer at the end of the project, at least on cropping system, but unfortunately, it will not be serious to tell you more now. We looked again at the data this week, and no, we cannot say something serious now. So in conclusion, we have a general positive effect of agroecological interventions on biodiversity and on climate change mitigation potential, at least for soil carbon sequestration and at least for N2O emission. Insufficient evidence for benefits on climate resilience. More long-term studies on agricultural system are needed. Also, being able to analyze in detail the carbon budget in this different system would probably help. But unfortunately, we were very poor in finding data showing this type of results, and it's not possible. You can use this result to discuss your data, but it's not possible to do any systematic review of the literature. And a number of uncertainties remain with respect to influence of a number of combination of agroecological intervention. We still believe by combining more is more likely to have to provide benefits, although the degree of agroecological transition we analyzed in our first paper did not really go in that direction. So thank you for your attention.
Yeah, so I'll be continuing to talk about this session on the performance of agroecology by talking about some work we've done in the project with myself, primarily my colleague Marie-Hélène Delove, who's also here with us today, but also a lot of other partners from the project. It was really a consortium-wide effort, as you'll see in a minute. So yes, I wanted to kind of start by acknowledging that evidence on the performance of agroecology is increasingly available. We heard before lunch from Bertrand about how we're getting some robust and promising results on impacts in terms of climate mitigation and biodiversity. However, some critical knowledge gaps persist. There was this perspective paper that came out by Heck et al. Just a few weeks ago that tried to map what some of these gaps are. And one of the key gaps I've identified is that while, oh, I don't think the clicker is working, Tim. It's all right, but I can continue anyways. So while we're gathering increasing evidence within these domains of climate, biodiversity, and socioeconomic resilience, what's really missing is an understanding of trade-offs across these domains, and particularly trade-offs with socioeconomic resilience. Another kind of knowledge gap that's persisting is that there's a lack of contextualized evidence. So we lack a really detailed understanding of what practices affect which performances under which conditions. So as you heard already, the Agroecology-TRANSECT project was a transdisciplinary project with this network of 11 innovation hubs that were very diverse in terms of the production systems they represented, from permanent grasslands to orchards to arable farms. Also in terms of the agroecological practices that they're promoting and experimenting with. We have conservation agriculture in Denmark, integrated crop livestock systems in Guadeloupe, but also in terms of the coordinating entities of each of these innovation hubs. In some cases, they were advisory services, in other cases, research centers or NGOs. So we had this very rich diversity, and this really represented an opportunity to together try and co-define what could be some promising indicators to monitor agroecological performance across these three domains of the project, and also during the lifetime of the project to actually monitor these to gather evidence that could be useful both to each of these innovation hubs individually, but together also to build this consolidated evidence on the performance of agroecology and to answer some of these questions on missing trade-offs and synergies. So this is a project that started really at the beginning. This is a process that started at the beginning of the project, and so it's been going for a long time, and the indicator definition process also lasted 2 years. So it was quite complex, and I've tried to summarize it briefly in terms of maybe what were 3 ingredients that characterized how the process took place, but also what were the necessary conditions for it to take place. And I think a first one to mention was the actual project governance approach. And I think 2 things that were key to how the project was designed was the fact that we met in person annually or biannually with all of the innovation hubs and researchers to actually have these in-person moments to prioritize these indicators, but also to test protocols, for example. And secondly, another key ingredient was the fact that the project really put this emphasis on reflexivity through structured moments of also facilitated reflection. And this was essential to a process which required a lot of also negotiation and prioritization of these indicators. And so it was important for us to be able to take these moments to reflect on whether we were on the right path or whether we needed to change course in a kind of trusted, safe environment. In terms of how we actually went about co-defining these indicators, we really wanted to follow a kind of bottom-up process and start with what was perceived as most important within each innovation hub individually. So we began by asking the question, what do the agroecological systems and practices within each of these innovation hubs aim to deliver across these 3 domains of biodiversity, socioeconomic resilience, and climate? And we then followed this with a question on how can we actually monitor contributions and progress on each of these criteria. We asked these questions individually across the innovation hubs, and then we also thematically tried to find commonalities that could form the basis of common criteria and indicators. We then had to kind of match this information also with the realities of monitoring contexts in the innovation hubs. And so this required a whole other set of discussions and questions on what are actually the expectations behind monitoring, at what scales are some of these indicators more relevant, with which resources, what resources do we have available in each of these contexts to be able to undertake this monitoring, with what skills, do we already have an established network of farmers or does this need to be established as well? But also to what extent do we want to rely on reproducible or qualitative indicators? So kind of this discussion around issues of feasibility, credibility, and salience to each of these diverse contexts. So after all of these discussions, they kind of resulted in this multi-criteria tool that we've called STREAM. So STREAM stands for Supporting Agroecological Transitions Through Co-Designed Evaluation and Monitoring. And we've identified 9 common evaluation criteria for monitoring across the innovation hubs. 2 of these focus on biodiversity. We differentiate between planned and associated biodiversity to address climate, quite naturally looking at climate mitigation on the one hand and climate adaptation on the other. And we then have 4 criteria looking more at the socioeconomic resilience domain, looking at economic viability and resilience, job satisfaction and job creation, participation in agroecological networks, and agroecological knowledge. We also complemented these with an additional criteria looking at animal health and welfare, which was important in several innovation hubs. And this was also a way to make sure that each of the 13 principles of the HLP of agroecology could be represented by this tool. To be able to monitor progress on these 9 evaluation criteria, we were able to identify 50 common indicators. However, these were also complemented by 116 that we called optional indicators, which were only monitored in either one or a subset of innovation hubs because they represented more specific properties. These indicators reflect both the farm and field scale, and they represent both practices but also outcomes. We were then keen to kind of position our tool within the existing monitoring tool literature, let's say. So we reviewed 13 existing tools that try to monitor agroecology also at the farm scale. And we did a quick comparison in terms of the number of core indicators that are present in these other tools for each of these 9 criteria. And what we can see is that the stream tool, which is towards the bottom, was able to kind of show a more balanced distribution of indicators across these 9 criteria in comparison to other tools. But what we also see is that it was able to do so through a more limited set of indicators than other tools that really aim to be as comprehensive. And so this is really a product of balancing these ambitions of trying to be comprehensive to monitor this holistic ambition of agroecology with also considerations for feasibility. We also see that there are some criteria that are more often underrepresented by tools. One of these is climate mitigation, but also animal health and welfare, but also participation in agroecological networks. And I don't think the clicker is working, Tim. I don't know if we can fix it, but oh yeah, thanks. But yeah, so I think it's a bit difficult to go through all of the criteria that we identified. So maybe just to highlight a few things. When we talked about biodiversity, we found it important to also look at temporal diversity in terms of rotations. We found it important to also put an emphasis on functional species, but also on management intensity proxies. Looking at climate mitigation, we tried to look at practices addressing carbon storage and sequestration, but also to look at emissions and energy consumption, and also to do some soil monitoring on soil organic carbon. In the economic domain, we tried to address this from an agroecological perspective, to look at autonomy from commercial inputs, to also look at opportunities for product valorization through transformation and processing of produce on farms, but also to look at the embeddedness of farms within local markets and direct sale channels. And then we also looked, there may be other things to mention. So for example, when we looked at job satisfaction, we tried to look at this from a qualitative perspective as well. We also tried to look at gendered division of labor. And when looking at participation in networks, we really wanted to understand to what extent this participation was also active, to try and look a bit at agency. So as I mentioned earlier, there was also a big set of optional indicators. So this also points a little bit to the limits of trying to have these standardized indicators. What we saw was that these optional indicators were primarily in the biodiversity and climate adaptation domains. And we conducted a multiple correspondence analysis, and we can see that maybe quite predictably, you can also explain these by the diversity of production systems represented by the innovation hubs. So for example, the more livestock-oriented innovation hubs required a whole set of indicators looking at animal welfare, for example, but also a different set of indicators for climate emissions, looking at emissions from livestock. And to another extent, they could also be explained by the different monitoring contexts of the innovation hubs. Some innovation hubs were really specialized in biodiversity monitoring and had dedicated teams to it. These capacities were not equally distributed across all of the teams. Maybe I'm going to have to disappoint you a little bit as well, because we're still in the data collection and analysis process. Looking at these results across the innovation hubs, we did a first run of results when we first piloted the tool in Spain, Belgium, and France. And here, what we can see through maybe just a simple correlation analysis is that we have quite some synergies, particularly in the climate and biodiversity domains, and between the climate and socioeconomic domains. And we have results that are forthcoming. So in the end, we were able to use the tool on more than 100 farms across each of the innovation hubs. So these represent 10 different European countries and 8 production systems. At the same time, we're also working on trying to understand these results from an individual innovation hub perspective, and also on trying to develop materials that can be used in bringing these results back to farmers. Here we have some results from the Spanish innovation hubs, just showing at how the results compare across the 5 farms that were monitored in each of these 9 criteria. And it's just a way to illustrate that we can see what are the more higher performing criteria that can maybe be used as a basis for formulating positive narratives around agroecology. And on the other hand, what could be maybe some entry points for furthering an agroecological transition. And I'm kind of concluding now, but what because we were in this kind of reflexive process with this project, we also took some time to kind of conduct a SWOT analysis of what were really the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that we saw with this tool, but also with this process. And there's a lot to mention, and I think this is also something that we continue to document. But maybe some strengths that we found was, well, what was appreciated by the Innovation Hub facilitators was the use of these optional indicators, so this kind of flexible component behind the tool. And there was also a perceived legitimacy because of the co-design process behind it. When we think about instead some of the weaknesses behind it, so I mentioned that we tried to come up with a reduced number of indicators that could maintain some feasibility, but 50 indicators is still a lot. It's complex both from a data collection perspective, but also from an analysis perspective to kind of make sense and mobilize all this information. And indeed, the tool is legitimate in the eyes of our project and these Innovation Hub facilitators and researchers. But as was mentioned also earlier today, there was still a distance to the farmers themselves, which in some cases are the end users of this information. So that's also something that can be questioned moving forward. So what is the outlook of this tool? Well, so we should have some papers coming out. One is under review on kind of the co-design process behind it and introducing this tool. Another one is under preparation, looking at these results of this analysis across all of the innovation hubs. And we're really working towards making this tool open access. So we're trying to gather and streamline all the information from data collection materials to the code to calculate the indicators to make it available on our website so it can hopefully be reused. But maybe more importantly, we spent some effort in this project on documenting this process. I talked a little bit about the process of co-designing these indicators, but the process continues now that we're analyzing in terms of discussing how do we benchmark these indicators, how do we aggregate them. We also had many discussions on how do we make our relationship with farmers more reciprocal. And so what we would like to do is to also aggregate all of our reflections within the project, as we think that this is really missing in the agroecological monitoring literature or the monitoring literature at large, and can provide some useful lessons beyond our project. And on that note, we're also in touch with the Agroecology Partnership that has a whole monitoring work package and is really trying to take stock of all these experiences in other European projects and all our lessons. So that's kind of a pathway for this work to continue. And I also wanted to highlight a new project that's just starting this month called Unmeasured, which involves one of our innovation hubs and which is also trying to take stock of existing tools to try and see to what extent are there still some blind spots in terms of some indicators, particularly in some domains which have so far resisted measurement. So these are indicators in a lot of the principles that Raquel mentioned this morning in the Nia-Lenny framework, looking at intergenerational justice, for example, or traditional knowledge systems. And so, yeah, I just wanted to highlight this exciting new project that will also be working on building and improving these tools so that they're a work in progress, let's say. And yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you.